Workers of the blue planet, unite! I remember just a few years ago, climate change was a back burner issue. Certainly not something that mainstream media and the political parties were interested in addressing seriously. But since Hurricane Katrina, the mood has shifted. The catastrophic loss of snowpack on the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets confirmed our worst fears. Punishing storms, hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons have hit far away and close to home. Extreme drought, the likes of which haven't been seen in generations, threatened vast swaths of each and every continent. And yet our political, social, and cultural leaders haven't lifted a finger to solve this crisis. They so blindly and so completely believe in the profit system that they are willing to deny reality, even when it's right in their faces, even if it means sentencing their own people to death in order to keep the system going for as long as possible. There are many factors which drive climate change, but the root cause is clear. Capitalism's bloodlust for profit is the underlying force that driving climate change. Fossil fuel companies' reckless drive to extract as much wealth as possible from the planet and its people, left unchecked and even encouraged by some, has radically changed the planet. They plan to burn every barrel of oil, every tank of natural gas, every ounce of coal, and their iron grip on the world's government and economy make that possible. This Mad Max scenario calls for radical solutions, and that's what eco-socialism is. The Freedom Socialist Party believes that in order to stop climate change and create an alternative to fossil fuels, we must overthrow capitalism and replace it with socialism. Yeah. The reason socialism is the only answer to this crisis is that there's a basic difference between the two economic systems. Capitalism relies on markets that run on the profit motive. Goods and services are produced only if there's a profit to be made in doing so. And capitalist enterprises will continue to produce that good even if it's dangerous, as long as there's profit to be made. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system of democratically planned production with the goal of responding to and providing for the needs of all people. And what's more basic than a clean, safe, and habitable planet? If we, the working class, were in power, we would not choose to render our one and only planet uninhabitable in exchange for a pile of green money or green paper. If the world's working class majority had the levers of state power and the resources of the largest corporations under its command, we would choose a very, very different future than what the capitalists have planned for us. Under socialism, advances in science and technology will be freed from the prison of the patent office, and the best ideas put to use in the service of the people, the planet, and all living things. Advances in renewable and clean energy production would be implemented because they are good ideas that help people and preserve the planet. Natural farming techniques would supplant our reliance on poisonous chemical fertilizers and GMOs. Sorry. But that doesn't mean a return to the 1800s. We have the technology and the know-how to produce more than enough food without harming the environment. For decades, and especially since the 2008 crisis, thousands of family farms have been gobbled up by the banks and sold off to large agribusinesses. This private ownership of the best farmland owned by mega corporations is holding us back from the opportunity to revitalize our farmlands and produce enough healthy, natural food for all. Under socialism, communally owned and democratically planned production of food and the distribution of that food would allow us to feed everyone. Another giant waste of our collective labor and resources is war. We are told by capitalist politicians that we are locked in a battle of good versus evil, and we must shoot and bomb all the evildoers in the world to spread democracy? What a load of bullshit. Wars, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have been primarily fought over resources and capitalist markets, not ideology. Under capitalism, the ruling class forces the world to accept this vicious imperialism. As the German military strategist and philosopher Karl von Clausewitz famously declared, war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. The world's nations use endless war as a means to carry out capitalist policy. That is, the repression of populations and the exploitation of labor and natural resources in order to lay ever larger profits at the feet of their capitalist rulers. A side effect of the U.S. war machine being the largest purveyor of violence on the planet is that it is also the largest consumer of fossil fuels. It's truly ironic that we burn oil so we can fight wars for more oil. True peace cannot come about under capitalism because its drive for profit, above all else, inevitably leads to war. In order to end war and the colossal amount of fossil fuels burnt in order to wage it, the working class must replace imperialist war with the class war. Upending the capitalist order and replacing it with socialism is the only way to put an end to capitalist war, dismantle the Pentagon, and redirect military spending towards building renewable energy sources and mass public transit. But to achieve this, first we'll need to build a broad movement which links all the struggles for social, economic, and ecological justice and directly confronts capitalism as the problem. Thankfully, a solid foundation has already been laid for us. Public consciousness of a looming economic catastrophe isn't new. Karl Marx, the father of modern socialism and the author of the Communist Manifesto, wrote about the inevitable decline of the environment under capitalism back in the mid-1800s. Back then, he already saw that capitalism was disrupting the ecosystem's balance. Before and since, scientists warned that carbon and chemical pollution and poor agricultural practices were threatening this balance. But it was only in the last 50 years that the environmental movement has really been on the move. In 1962, Nature author Rachel Carson published Silent Spring and became a national figure for exposing the environmental and human costs of pesticide use and the lies that American people were told by corporations and the government about these chemicals. Andrea mentioned Agent Orange being used in the Vietnam War, and this was one of the chemicals that this book led to being banned. The book was widely published and thrust environmental issues into the forefront of the American consciousness and became a rallying point for the fledgling environmental movement. Although she was never public about her politics because of the threat of McCarthyism, we can be sure that Carson was indeed an anti-capitalist. Not only did she criticize chemical companies for their brazen destruction of the environment for profit, but she also called out the scientific community for its close ties with industry, saying, "The screening of basic truth is done to serve the gods of profit and production." Since then, the environmental movement has exploded in growth and is currently divided into two camps. The first and most visible is the NGO-led movement made up of liberal groups which believe that the climate crisis can be addressed through governmental means such as reforms and government action. Yeah, right, yeah. The other, less visible side of the movement is a hodgepodge of grassroots organizations that work outside the system. These groups generally don't trust the government or corporations to make meaningful changes, so they organize resistance from below and take the fight directly to those who profit from pollution. NGOs proliferated, by the way, that's non-governmental associations, proliferated in America following the ebb of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. Grassroots movements that raised their own money and elected their own leaders were displaced by large NGOs funded by foundations and grants with appointed boards of directors. Under the banner of the environmental movement, the NGOs sell the idea that capitalism can be reformed to be environmentally friendly. They run on money, and that money usually comes from rich donors and corporate grants, which severely limits their message and the actions that they can take. Because if a donor doesn't like what they're doing, they can always pull the funding. These groups distribute petitions, send letters and emails to officials, and stage what I call photo op protests to put pressure on politicians. Last Sunday's huge People's Climate March in New York is an example of these NGOs at work. While they made sure to get many and diverse groups to attend, and in fact our comrades in New York did attend, the NGOs tightly controlled the march's organizing and message to stage a 300,000 person photo op to pressure the UN to act on climate change. However, the march didn't go by the UN's headquarters, nor did it go by the climate changers' headquarters on Wall Street. Instead, the march had no political demands other than climate action, and took people along a route that deliberately did not confront the ruling class. Green NGOs politely ask politicians to adopt green policies like carbon trading, carbon offsets, private investment in clean energy, and holding polluting companies accountable through the courts. They try to get their quote, candidates elected so that the government will respond to their issue. They idealize nonviolent protest and go to great lengths to keep other issues out of the movement to remain respectable in the eyes of these politicians. Issues like environmental racism, anti-colonialism, ecofeminism, and eco-socialism. This has led many to criticize the environmental movement as a whites-only movement, but that's just not the case. The most effective grassroots organizations that are those that connect the struggles against racism, sexism, colonialism, and capitalism to the fight for climate justice. Not satisfied with signing petitions online and attending photo ops, they take the fight directly to the climate changers. Through community organizing and coalition building, they build diverse organizations that confront polluters and disrupt business as usual. Women's leadership is at the forefront of the fight for climate justice. Eco-feminist fighters who connect capitalism's oppression of women to its oppression of nature struggle for a better future because they're the ones most affected by climate change. 70% of the world's poor are women, and it is the poor that will be most hurt by climate change and the least able to adapt to it. Grassroots organizations were on display the day after New York's People's Climate March. Last Monday, 1,000 protesters, people of all colors, all genders, indigenous people, and immigrants, participated in the Flood Wall Street action by descending on Wall Street and calling for the institutions that profit from fossil fuels to be shut down. Over 100 activists were arrested in a sit-in, and the protests shut down several blocks around Wall Street. Yeah. Now, imagine how different that would have been if 300,000 people had been there. You know, the activists who organized the action called out capitalism as the root cause of the climate crisis as, quote, an economic system based on the exploitation, based on exploiting frontline communities, workers, and natural resources. Frontline communities are those that live on or near the land where energy companies extract resources. They bear the effect of mining, fracking, and mountaintop removal. Contaminated waterways, aquifers, and wells, toxic fumes, earthquakes, mudslides, and cancer epidemics are all over the place in these frontline communities. Native Americans in the U.S., First Nations people in Canada, and Indigenous peoples in Mexico make up the bulk of frontline communities. While the big green NGOs have turned a blind eye to these struggles, Indigenous people have organized and fought back. In the US, they partner with non-natives in grassroots groups like tar sands blockade in Utah, where the first tar sands pit in the US was opened earlier this year, I think. And also in the Great Plains tar sands resistance in Oklahoma and Texas. They physically disrupt the extraction process by chaining their bodies to bulldozers and excavators, blockading caravans of equipment being transported to excavation sites, and organizing communities to stand up to the institutions that fund energy companies. The indigenous Mexicans have formed community police forces and self-defense forces to wage an armed struggle against the drug cartels who are supplied with weapons by the U.S. and force people off their land so multinational corporations can strip mine for gold and other precious metals. The Mexican government has responded by jailing the movement's most prominent leaders, such as Nestora Salgado, which Sue mentioned, and Dr. Jose Manuel Mireles. But the government's efforts haven't caused the people to back down, and the movement for self-defense is spreading throughout Mexico. The Freedom Socialist Party, in collaboration with its partners in the Committee for Revolutionary International Recruitment, led the movement to agitate for the release of these two leaders and all political prisoners in Mexico, and for economic and political democracy for indigenous Mexicans. We're making progress, and the movement is growing in concert with the indigenous self-defense movement. To the north, Canada's First Nations launched the Idle No More movement in 2012 to demand enforcement of their treaties and respect for their lands. Ariel Deranger of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations in Alberta, Canada, issued a call for action saying, quote, "Our people and our Mother Earth can no longer afford to be economic hostages in the race to industrialize our homelands. It's time for our people to rise up and take back our role as caretakers and stewards of the land," end quote. First Nations leaders show their commitment to ecofeminism by including women at the decision table, and they have no respect for neoliberal development on their lands. By practicing their traditions, they organize their communities to stand up to tar sands extraction and pipelines across Canada. Now I'd like to discuss the stereotypes of environment versus jobs. A lot of noise has been made about this issue, but unions and labor activists have been on the forefront of giving their members a voice and protecting them from environmental hazards on the job. Migrant farm workers struggling for union recognition rose up in the 1960s against toxic pesticides in the fields. Union workers at nuclear facilities have blown the whistle on nuclear contamination and its effects on residents, and have been successful in holding corporations accountable in many instances, but some workers have paid for it with their lives. Karen Silkwood, who worked at a nuclear fuel plant in Ohio, was murdered in 1974 in an effort to cover up numerous violations of health regulations she had investigated as part of her union's bargaining committee. Judy Berry, a feminist, labor leader, and organizer with Earth First, organized solidarity between eco-activists and union workers to end logging in California's redwood forests. She too was targeted for assassination. In 1990, a car bomb was placed in her car and exploded with her in it. Luckily, she didn't die in the blast, but she was severely injured and had to cut back her activities. Berry's legacy lives on in the organizing to link workers' struggles to environmental issues. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters took up this mantle in 1999 at the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle by organizing with environmental groups for a Teamsters and Turtles contingent in the protest. However, some conservative union leaders, particularly in the construction trades, fall into the trap that corporations lay for them. With unionization at an all-time low, corporations that are usually averse to unions suddenly offer jobs to the unions. They hope that by luring the union in, they will spoil any attempts at solidarity with the environmentalists and split the movement against the destructive activities. We need to counter these actions with demands that speak to the workers themselves, like nationalization of the energy companies under worker and community control, massive investment in renewable energy, and for retraining programs for workers in new technologies. Yeah. I want one of those jobs. Unions and grassroots organizations are effective because they are made up of and led by the people who are most affected by resource extraction, pollution, and climate change. Since the 1960s, African Americans have led struggles in their communities against refineries, incinerators, garbage dumps, toxic waste facilities, and oil pipelines. They were put there intentionally and built there intentionally by, in those communities by corporations. Many of the leaders fight this environmental racism. Many of the leaders who fight this environmental racism came out of the civil rights movement and brought the same tactics used in those historic freedom struggles. In the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, which hit poor communities of color the hardest, it was grassroots organizations in those communities that provided the most relief for victims. It should be a concern how little help the federal and state governments were in these disasters. In New Orleans, the National Guard was sent in not to search for survivors, but to protect the property of business owners. Images of guardsmen gunning down people of color as they scavenged for food and water are burned into our national psyche. And after the floodwaters had retreated, the government used the disaster to realize numerous neoliberal dreams like charter schools and privatized public services. Right. In New York, the feds airdropped supplies in and said, "Good luck." Thankfully, this was after the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the grassroots sprang into action. Freedom Socialist Party and radical women members in New York and the surrounding area distributed supplies to stranded survivors alongside groups like Occupy Sandy. The iconic picture of a public hospital without electricity directly next to a lit-up Goldman Sachs building said it all. The response of the government and corporations to these disasters shows us what's in store for us in a future which climate change-induced super hurricanes wreck coastal cities, drought forces mass migration, and farmland dries up. The world will descend into barbarism, where democracy is a thing of the past and only the strongest survive. We need to act now to change this trajectory to one that values and respects all life. This can be done by recognizing that our interconnected issues necessitate a united movement. To truly solve the climate crisis, we need to replace capitalism with a sane system of organizing the production and distribution of our needs based on inclusive democratic decision-making and that's the promise of socialism. We must start by respecting and valuing the leadership of indigenous peoples, women, and workers. The Freedom Socialist Party calls for a united front. A true united front differs from most coalitions in America in that it has working class leadership, not one that will hand over control to the people who will subvert militancy and keep the effort confined within the Democratic Party or other reformist channels. It's also democratic, with participants showing each other respect despite their differences. FSP believes that if the United Front begins with honest debate about the political basis of unity, we will find the strongest common ground and become a fighting force. It is not necessary for groups to give up their identities, but it is necessary for these organizations to unite under one banner. A united front should strive to be inclusive. It should welcome unionized and unorganized workers while reaching out to youth, women, immigrants, people of color, and LGBTQ communities. While the front orients towards the issues, when the front orients towards the issues of the most discriminated against, it rallies the best fighters to its cause. And when the oppressed push up from the bottom rungs of the ladder, it brings everyone up. The climate change movement needs clear, revolutionary demands and radical leadership that has learned the lessons of the past struggles and revolutions, both successful and unsuccessful. That's what the FSP brings to the table in spades. Our goal is not to be a thorn in the side of multinational polluters. We want to build a movement that can win tangible victories and bring about revolutionary changes that will end the exploitation of people and the planet. As a participant in the Occupy Wall Street movement, I saw what the lack of this type of movement can do. When I called the first General Assembly of Occupy Seattle, a united front is what I pushed for. But the movement threw the baby out with the bathwater and decided to disavow formal leadership. Without dedicated leadership, without common political ground, and without democracy and inclusiveness in decision-making, the movement was easily crushed by the police. I hope that a united front that fights for climate justice does not choose leaderlessness as a model, because we just can't waste more time on that failed strategy. I look forward to the discussion tonight and invite you all to sign up for our study group on eco-socialism, where we're going to be applying Marxist analysis to ecological issues. Now I want to end with this eco-socialist call to action. Workers of the blue planet, unite! Thank you.